Chris Swanson joining us from Trojan Sports to break down USC as the Trojans prepare for the Pac-12 championship game against Stanford, a rematch from a 42-24 win that they had over the Cardinal. So USC may be in a position unlike any other team in the country in which they played 12 consecutive games. So for people who are unaware, Notre Dame has a series long-standing with both USC and to a lesser extent Stanford. So they play one of them on the Thanksgiving weekend. Therefore, you've got 11 teams within the Pac-12 that need to play football. Therefore, that's impossible. So only 10 of them play. One gets a bye prior to the Pac-12 championship game. So it only helps, I guess, if you actually make the Pac-12 championship game. So on the plus side, the Trojans get to prepare for 2 weeks and rest up and get ready for this game, especially it being on a Friday. Stanford coming off a pretty tough game on a Saturday 6 days earlier. On the downside, of course, USC had to play 12 consecutive games and got a bit banged up. So how do you perceive that glass half full, glass half empty scenario?
I think that if you're USC and you're going into the championship game, they got into it. You're happy you have the bye week before. It's an advantage. You get an extra week to prepare, an extra week to rest up. But if you had asked USC, their players, their coaches at any point during this season, they would have wanted to have a bye week during the season, they would have taken it. They probably would have that same answer now. It really impacted them playing 12 straight weeks. You could just see the injuries piling up. I think you saw it kind of all fall apart against Notre Dame. It's a terrible loss. It shouldn't have been that bad, and it was because of how banged up they were. They were playing a true freshman at nose tackle. It just got out of control. So I think that at this point, because USC did manage to win 10 games, did manage to win their division, it's an advantage coming into this game. You can't argue that. Stanford played a very physical and tough Notre Dame team. I know that they won pretty big, but they were banged up after that game. They could have, I think, 4 defensive starters missing for this game. So I think if you're looking at it from a perspective of who has the advantage, with the bye situation just for the Pac-12 championship game, USC does. It's a big advantage, and I think they could take advantage of it. They're able to rest for a week before a game against Stanford, and USC kind of runs a similar sort of thing where they're trying to wear you out too. So big advantage for USC there.
And yes, USC expects to win every game. Yes, I believe they were favored in every game if you take them as individual games, but we talked about it preseason, and yes, this team and actually the expectations more so outside the program were to get to a college football playoff, but they do win the 10 games. They win their division. They get to the Pac-12 championship game. And I believe you said a number of times that your estimation of the results of this season, because it's so difficult to go 12 consecutive games, especially when you schedule in the non-conference like USC does, to win 12 consecutive games. And I think you tabbed them to go 10-2.
I did. So they met the expectations I had for them. I know that they fell short of the playoffs, which a lot of people thought that they were preseason favored to do that, and the national title and going undefeated and all that. I think the question about whether or not USC met expectations, though, kind of comes down to when you look at the individual games and how well they performed. While they did exactly what I expected them to do record-wise, I expected them to win the South. There's been a few games where it's been kind of suspect. The Notre Dame loss shouldn't have been that big. Looking at what Washington State has turned into, they probably should not have lost that game. There's been a few games that have been closer than probably should have been. I think they've only won 3 games by 14 or more points. So there's a debate amongst the fans right now, especially on our message board at Trojansports.com, about whether or not this season is meeting the standards and expectations that USC has. I think that if you expected USC to go undefeated and be a top 4 team, you probably expected a little bit too much. But I understand the disappointment as well, because USC hasn't blown out, a bunch of teams that are inferior to them. They only have 2 or 3 blowouts all year, and they've played a bunch of teams that, for the most part, shouldn't compete with them. And then when you look at the teams that went 9-3 and kind of have a similar record to them, USC struggled against those teams. I believe they're 1-2 against teams that are 9-3. So I understand both sides of it. I think that you'd probably be a little crazy to complain about a 10-2 season if they win the conference. You'd be a little crazy to complain about that, or just say Clay Helton did a bad job. But I understand where some fans are coming from when they say they think this team should have done more and they expect more, without question.